Hey everyone. So hopefully you've already seen the first couple of videos in the series, but this is the third video in how to win with just a knight and a bishop. Now this is a really complicated endgame, or at least that's what a lot of people think. And so a lot of people ignore studying this because it happens so rarely in a game. And that's fair, but I saw two games while watching the U.S. online qualifiers for the U.S. Championship that involved a knight and bishop, and the games ended in draws because master level players didn't know how to do this. Now, a lot of people say, well, it happens so rarely, why bother? And they're right, it doesn't happen very often. But the point of learning the knight and bishop checkmate is not just so that you can win with the knight and bishop, but because when I learned this, my ability to coordinate my knight and bishop anywhere in the game really increased a lot. And this video is really going to show that come in. Because what we've seen so far is we've looked at how do we take a king. Let's say we have a black king over here on A8, but we have a dark squared bishop in the game. And so you remember from the last video, we started in a position something like this, okay? We had the king in the corner that was a different color than our bishop. And the idea is we've got to get the king all the way over to the other corner because that's where we can checkmate. Well, and in this video, we're going to say, how do we get to this position or some other position we know from anywhere on the board? And what you're going to see is this requires learning how to make the knight and bishop work together to create barriers or to create walls that the king can't get around. Now, the cool thing is that's a skill you can use anywhere in a game where you can use your knight and bishop to create walls and barriers. So what I do want to point out before we jump into this one is just to show you a couple of patterns that are really nifty with the knight and bishop. Let's say I've got this bishop and knight diagonally aligned. Notice that this knight is covering the b3 square, the b5 square, the c6 square, and the e6 square. Well, look at what the bishop's covering. a3, b4, b6, d6, and e7. Look at that major wall that has been created by just these two pieces. You put your king somewhere on the board, and you can finish closing things off. And you create a barrier that an opposing king can't get through. They can't even get to your king or get to your pieces. And so it gives you some opportunity to, for example, step your king in and tighten that barrier. Okay? So that's kind of one of the ideas with getting to a position you're already familiar with in the knight and bishop checkmate, is understanding you're trying to create barriers that force the opposing king to a wall and then force him to one of the two corners. Because once he's in one of the two corners, then you can transfer that into something you already know from the previous videos. So let's go ahead and set this up in a way that would be kind of the furthest you could possibly get from checkmate. All right, you can't get any further than your king and your pieces on one edge of the board and their king in the center. All right, the idea for the defending king is to stay in the center. If he can avoid getting to a wall, that's good. If he can avoid getting to a corner, that's good. If he avoids getting into the black corner, I mean, that's where checkmate happens with the dark squared bishop. So we're going to run through a few scenarios here. The first one is the black king is going to try to attack white's pieces. All right, let me go ahead and load this so it'll let me play through it. Okay, so at this point, we're going to start trying to corral the king, but instead of the king running away or trying to stay in the corner, the king is going to try to attack the white pieces and get close to those. Okay, so generally one of your best pieces for forcing the other king back is your king. So it's a good idea to start by stepping your king up towards the opposing king. You'll see now this king is blocking off these squares and your knight is covering f3. So king is covering c3 through e3 and your knight is covering f3. All right, so let's say this king is expecting you to start maneuvering your pieces one way. He's going to come off of there and move towards the king's side. So he moves over to c4. Okay, so remember we have this barrier here from your king, c3 through e3. Next thing we want to do is try to continue pushing that king either back towards the far wall or over to the side wall. And so that, if you'll notice, the d4 square that's been vacated can be attacked in a couple of ways. We can attack that with the knight, moving it to c2 or to f3, or we can attack it with the bishop going to b2. In this position, I'm pretty sure the best way to do that is with the knight, because if we can somehow convince this king to come into this corner, the bishop's already in a position that we know how to get checkmate from. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the knight over to c2. Okay, so now we have the king controlling c3 and d3. The knight is controlling d4 and b4. Okay, so like I said, we're working with the opposing king is attacking our pieces. So that king is going to step up to b3. Again, this is not necessarily the best moves that I'm making for black. The evaluation right now is saying that it doesn't really matter what I move right now. It's all the same. White has advantage, but the computer can't find the win. Okay, this is really complicated for computer. So the king steps down to b3. So what we want to do now is to continue to cut off that king's ability to escape back to where it was. We're going to send our king up to d3. All right, we are now blocking off c4 and c3 with our king and protecting our knight on c2. And the knight is blocking off b4. Okay. Obviously, the best thing for the black king to do at this point is to run away from this dark squared corner. But like I said, I wanted to run through a few scenarios. So this one, he's going to try to attack your pieces. So he moves over to a2. Clearly not the greatest move. But here is a really cool point we are now at. Notice we've been taking away a square from the king every time he moves. So right now the bishop is taking away a3 and b2. Our king is taking away c3 and c2. We just need to take away the b3 square. There are a couple of ways we can do that. The fastest way to do that would be to play something like knight to d4, right? That's going to take away the square and allow the king to step into a position we're very familiar with. So let's take the knight to d4. So now we have the bishop is blocking b3, a3 and b2. The knight is covering b3 and c2. So the only way the king can get out is to come towards your bishop, which has just responded with king to d2. And now we have everything covered. Okay. That's one way we could have done it. We could have protected with king to d2. Another way we could do it, since the king moved away from the b3 square, we can abandon it for the time being and use our knight to protect. And so now our barrier looks like this. And the moment the king steps back to a2, the white king steps in. And this is a position you all should know from the first video, is using the king and the bishop to get the king completely corralled. At this point, the king can only step back and forth. Your knight is already in position to jump to c3 to deliver check when it's time, so the king steps back. At this point, you can go check. There's only one legal move now, and that is king to a2, followed by checkmate. It also works if you'd gone to knight c1. And so that's the ending that we saw in the first video. So you can see that that was 8 moves. We just took a knight and bishop and checkmated the king in 8 moves. Now, he didn't make the best moves here. Like I said, this is one where we're playing where he's trying to attack your pieces. So let's reset this and give him a different strategy. All right, let's clear the board here. Put the king back. the bishop back, the knight back, and the black king back. All right, here we go again. So this time, what we're going to have to do, the black king is going to assume that if it can just avoid either of the two corners, it's going to be okay. It's going to try to stay in the center unless it has to move, but it's going to do the best to avoid the two corners. And we're going to see that we can still checkmate this king. It's going to take a lot more moves, but we're still going to be able to do this. Okay. So again, we want to use our king to first create the initial barrier right along here. So we play king to d2, blocking off the escape, blocking off c3, d3, and e3, and the knight is there also blocking off f3. Now remember, the king is going to try to stay in the corner and try to stay away from the wall. So in this case, instead of moving the king over to c4, we're going to shift him over to c4. Now I still think knight c2 is a good move. So at this point, we now have the knight is now taken away, d4. The king is also helping out here with blocking off d3 and e3. The king could start running towards this corner, which is possible, but like I said, the strategy that I'm assuming the black king has here is he's trying to stay in the center of the board. So instead of moving out of the center, he's going to try to stay in these four center squares, and we're going to have the king move king to d5. And so when that happens, again, you just step up the king, take away that barrier, preventing the king from walking back towards the center. At this point, the king can never come back into these two center squares. He'll have to stay somewhere in the top half of the board. All right, so after we play king to d3, we'll have black play king to e5, moving to the only other possible square. At this point, I want to go ahead and start moving my bishop a little bit closer and start helping with taking away squares. So I'm going to play bishop to e3. Okay. So at this point, we now have the knight has taken away, the king has taken away c4, d4, e4. The bishop is covering f4 and c5. All right. So king is still going to try to stay in the center by moving to d5. Now we can bring our bishop in, and it is blocking off c5 and e5 while our king is protecting the bishop and these squares. So you see, we've kind of, again, we've created this sort of barrier. The king has to step back towards the far wall. Okay, after bishop d4, we're going to just have the king step straight back, again trying to stay in the corner, or trying to stay in the center and avoid the corners. So we can now take away that square that was just occupied by using our knight. Hopefully you recognize that this pattern here is something the knight can jump around and get to in two moves. So we have two places we can move the knight to. We can move the knight to b4, or we can move the knight to e3. Personally, I like either one, because that's really where I want my knight to end up anyways, because that's where we picked up from the last video, was the knight right here on d5. So either way works. For this one, I'm going to play knight to b4. Now the reason I want to do knight to b4 is because it actually takes away another square, not just d5. It also takes away the c6 square. So you see how the knight is covering both of these squares, the bishop is covering all of these, and the king has that square. So we've got a pretty good barrier here. The king can't come around it too quickly. So his choice is head towards the corner or try to slip back around on the other side of the barrier. So in this case, we're going to assume that the king is trying to avoid the corners. So we're going to play the king over to e6, after which we play king e4. Okay, well that now extends our barrier because we now have possession of the f5 square. The bishop already had f6. And so we've created a new containment zone for that king. Okay. So the king has a choice. He can try to stay here in the containment zone, or he can try to slip back around. Okay, so after king e4, we're going to move the king back to d6. He's trying to stay away from the corners. Well, since the knight is protecting the square in front of the bishop, and the bishop has these squares, then we're free to use the king to tighten that barrier again. So we can now play king to f5. Okay. We've taken away another square, and this black king keeps getting that barrier tighter and tighter around it. So at this point, king would step back to king d7. Again, trying to avoid the corners. That's the way we're thinking. And so you can now take away the d6 square with your king by moving to king e5. Okay. So again, let's look at the squares we have controlled now. The bishop has b6, the knight has c6, and the king has d6, e6, and f6. So we've got a nice wall here. The king cannot easily get around. Okay, so then we'll have king move to e7. Again, trying to stay here in the center. That does move it closer to the dark corner, but this king is trying to stay here right in the middle. So after king e7, now we can actually even move our knight to that spot that we would like for it to end out if possible, and that's knight to d5. And the reason we're going to do that now is because this king is directly opposed to our king, so it kind of gives us a free move in because the king's not going to be able to slip around. So let's go ahead and move knight to d5. That does put the king in check. We are now controlling these squares. And so the king has to make a choice. Does it try to slip around out the back, or does it stay in the center knowing it's about to be pushed onto the wall? If it gets pushed onto the wall, then we should be able to move our pieces into a position that's familiar pretty quickly. Particularly since this knight is already where it was in the previous video. So what we're going to do at this point is try to get this king to slip around, because it looks like we don't have a whole lot of control. We've got these squares, but maybe the king can slip out real fast. So we're going to play king to f7 this time. Okay, so what we have controlled from our king are these squares. And the king is going to try to escape this way. So if we can take away these dark squares and then move the king over, then we trap the king. So at this point, the best place we can get our bishop is onto this diagonal, which is also nice because it might even help us take away this square eventually too. So we're going to shift the bishop over to b6, planning on taking away these squares. We're going to say that this king is still going to attempt to get out of here by playing king to g6. Okay. And that allows us to play bishop to d8. And now notice we have these squares on the f file, f6, f5, and f4 blocked by our king. But we now have g5 and h4 as well. And so if the king decides to continue running to escape, the king should see very quickly, then our king will step up to f5 and his escape will be blocked and he will be trapped in that corner. And so instead we're going to push the king back to f7, at which point we can now play bishop f6, which is a great spot for that bishop. It's protected by the knight and the king. We have now taken away a lot of the black king squares, and it's starting to get really limited. If it tries to escape either way, we can use the knight to take off the last square. Okay, so let's just go ahead with king f8. Let's say the king is just going to play f8, hoping to get a chance. And so we'll play king to e6. It doesn't really matter what the king played there. If it played to e8, we'd also play king e6 here, because at that point we have now completed some more barrier here. Okay. And so again, there's just not much space for this king to get out. Okay? But the king knows he wants to avoid this corner over here. But if he moves to the square e8, there's a really fast checkmate. So we're going to have king go to g8 instead. And we're going to just continue to tighten things down. King e7 to take away the square the king just left. So should be a pretty common thing that you notice is whenever the king steps away, we try to take away that square without losing the barrier that we had. So now the king has to play to h7, and we'll now play to king f7. Again, containing the king all the way on this barrier. King h6 is then met with knight to f4, and now we own it all. The king is now completely corralled in the corner. All we need to do is maneuver our bishop back around to the f8 square if we'd like, and then we have mate. The evaluation tells me that we do have mate in 8, maybe even, and actually mate in 4. Sorry, we should have mate in 4 from this point. If you don't get it in 4, that's okay. It probably could take a little bit longer than 4 if you're just moving into the position we talked about in the first video. So let's show again how that happens. The king has to step back to h7, at which point we can now maneuver our bishop over back to f8 by coming through g8. Sorry, ooh, that was not the right move. Hang on. That would be a draw. Don't do that. Wrong way. We go to g5 first. Sorry. Bishop to g5. Takes away the square the king was just at. Right. So now we have the king corralled. The king has to step to h8. Bishop comes to h6. King steps to h7. Bishop comes here, and here we go. This is the position you should be familiar with, that hopefully you've practiced. The king is now stuck, has to come here, and now it's just maneuvering our knight to a square that it's going to be able to give check. We generally want to give check on the square f6 or f8 with the knight. So all it takes is any knight move should do, as long as it gets closer. So let's just play knight d5 works, knight h5 works, knight e6 works. All of them work. Every single one of them works, I think. So the king then comes to h6, and now we have check. King steps back and checkmate. That was 20 moves. So we took a position where the king was as far away from checkmate as possible, played logically, played by a pattern where he's just trying to stay in the center, stay away from the wall, stay away from the corners. And even with the king making the most logical moves to do that, we checkmated in 20 moves. Okay, let's do one more scenario. And we're going to show that it does actually take the most time if the king goes back to the wrong corner. If it goes back to the opposite color corner, it does take the longest. Remember, we just did that in 20 moves, okay? The first one we did in all of 8 moves. This one, the king is going to try to stay in the center, but when forced away, go ahead and make a run for the opposite corner compared to our bishop. Okay, so again, just like before, we're going to play king d2. Actually, hang on, let me load the setup here. Okay, king d2, king e4, just like before, and then knight to c2. We'll go, at this point, the king is going to go to d5. Remember, now the king is okay running to the corner if it has to. We'll play king d3, king e5, and bishop e3, king d5. This should all look pretty familiar at this point. This is all some of the same moves we did last time. Again, the king is trying to stay in the center, but at this point, we've kind of forced him out. The king can no longer stay in the center. The king has to keep trying to work his way around or make a run for it to the other side. Notice when he did not run for the other side, we were able to trap him over at the corner where he got checkmated. So we will let him try to stay around here just a little bit longer. King e6, king e4, knight d6, king f5, and now the king gives up and runs for the corner. King c7. Okay. After king c7, we just need to follow with our own king, king e6. Notice the king couldn't have done anything else. Remember, the knight and the bishop actually own all these squares. So right now, we already have this king trapped because of where we had our knight and our bishop. Okay. So the king can't come around and attack our pieces. It's too late. So after we play king to e6, we have king b7. Again, giving up that control. So we just take away another square, king d6. Always giving him the option to go ahead and go to the wall and go to the corner we want him in. If he's smart, he won't take it. His best move is to continue just coming this way. But notice we now have him blocked off here. Okay, so we just played king to d6. The king goes ahead and steps into the corner and says, I dare you to figure out how to push me out of here. King c6, king b8, and now we move our knight to d5, king a8, and this picks up where the last video started. This is where video 2 starts, this position right here. We may have had the bishop on e3 instead of d4, but you'll see this is it. We have used 12 moves to get to this position, and it will take us another 16 moves to make checkmate if black makes the best moves possible. And so I can show you those real fast, but if you really want to study that, make sure you go back to the previous video and work through that, learn the explanations, and get practice, because at this point, this is the point where it should be just from memory. Once you get to this position where you have the king in the corner, your king diagonally opposed, and the knight on the other side of the king, and the bishop on one of the diagonals adjacent to the enemy king. At this point, it should just be from memory. I don't want to use the knight to check on h6. I want to go b6. Sorry, I want to go to c7. That way, the bishop is still attacking along that diagonal. So we have knight c7. King has to come to b7. The trickiest move right here is make a waiting move. Just move that bishop along that diagonal. It doesn't matter where, just anywhere, because now the king can't get back to a8. Has to step over. And now we've taken away a new square. King continues to step over. And the knight, we now have an entire barrier here. Now remember, if the king steps back to c8, it turns out it's a faster checkmate, because that's going to allow the knight to come to e8, forcing check. The king has to go to d8, then your king steps over, protecting the knight, and now this king has a long way to go around, and you're going to be able to trap him into the corner much faster. So the fastest thing for the king to do is actually e8 here, followed by king to d6. King tries to get out to f7, and next move is knight to e7. The king can't obviously step on g6, but trying to get away, the king will come to the king will come to f6 or g7. F6 is the more natural one, even though it actually turns out to be a little bit, I think it's one move faster for checkmate if the king goes to f6. So bishop comes to e3, and we've got a nice solid barrier here. Every one of these squares is protected, and at this point the king is trapped in the corner, and so we're going to have no problem at this point, finishing it off. So once we come bishop to g6, again, we now have tightened it down even further. And the king is going to have to make some move. If he comes away from the bishop, then you're going to maneuver your knight back to e5. If he comes towards the bishop, then you will step your king over and start locking things down really fast. So the fastest thing, the best thing for the black king to do is to take a step this way. And at this point, we are going to be able to maneuver our knight back to here. Now at this point, you should recognize that this pattern, we've now blocked him in here. And actually, our king has already taken the square away. So once come here, king steps up. The king is, again, stuck in this area right here. So the king can step this way, but once it does, then our king is going to step in and just continue to tighten things down. If the king steps up, then we're going to bring our bishop over here, so that once the king tries to chase, our bishop's here. Now, as long as the knight is on e5, it's guarding f7 and g6. So this bishop's doing a great job at finishing the barrier, and as long as the king is there in time to protect the bishop, you're in good. You're great. The king has to step over now, and now we've got that full barrier where the king is blocking g8, g7, and g6, and the bishop is finishing with h6. So the king can step down, but then we now have the chance to maneuver our knight around, and we deliver check. King steps over, and checkmate. All right, so there are a couple of spots in there that I made a little bit slower move where I moved the king where I could have made a different move with the bishop. So this one actually took us 32 moves. You should set up this position with a computer, with some software, put it on its highest level, its most skilled level, and play through it. See what sort of numbers you're getting. If you're getting checkmate in around 25 to 35, you've got this. You understand how this works. If you're running up to 50, that's a draw. Remember, you have to get mate in under 50 moves. Otherwise, it is a draw. So try it from a few different positions. Make sure that you feel like you can get to checkmate from anything. Once you've got it at the best skill level, drop the skill level. See if you can handle it, but it doesn't make the same moves every time. But practice this. It's a really useful skill, and hopefully this will be useful to you, and you will start coordinating your knights and bishops really effectively. Like I said, it's really cool seeing how they make these barriers that the enemy king can't get around. And if you can do that in this scenario, you can do that in any other point in the game. And it'll take your game to that new level where you're visualizing the squares you control even better. All right, so that's it for the Knight and Bishop series. Stay tuned, and we will be doing a new series soon.